This is the Center for Religion in the City. The next stop is Contagion, Religion, and Cities. Welcome to the third episode of the Contagion podcast. I'm your host, Sharaf Gantareen, and I'm joined by my co-host, Amanda Furiase, and a group of scholars, critical thinkers, I would even say pioneers, interested and invested in learning more about combining and merging the study of religion and health. Let me briefly introduce each one of them to you. Giselle Toruno, Harold Morales, Christina Rossetti, Sierra Lawson, Kayla Wheeler, Daisy Vargas, and our special guest for today's podcast, Brett Hendrickson. Brett teaches at Lafayette College in Eastern Pennsylvania, where he currently holds the title of the Associate Professor of Religious Studies, as well as the chair of the Latin American and Caribbean Studies program. In 2014, Brett wrote his first monograph entitled Border Medicine, a Transcultural History of Mexican-American Curanderismo. And 3 years later, in 2017, he wrote a second monograph entitled The Healing Power of Santuario de Chimayo, America's Miraculous Church. Today we gather to have a deep discussion of Brett's first book, Border Medicine. And for us to start off this discussion, we have Dr. Daisy Vargas with a brief summary of the key insights in that book about religion, health, and the Southwest region.
Hello, everyone. Good morning from Tucson, Arizona. I want to thank the Center for the Study of Religion in the City for inviting me to introduce today's guest, Brett Hendrickson. Brett, I'm looking forward to our conversation today and hearing more about your work. Earlier, in fact, just a couple moments ago, we were talking about our connections to the center and that summer funding that I got from the center last year touches a bit kind of overlaps a bit of onto what you write about, which is botanicas and healing, right? So I'm excited to talk to you today. I first encountered Brett Hendrickson's book, Border Medicine, in graduate school at UC Riverside. I was actually 2 years into field work with a curandera in a botanica in Anaheim. And like many historians of the northern Mexican borderlands, I was deep into the literature on what I like to call the Trinity of Mexican borderland folk saints. Teresita Urrea, Don Pedrito Jaramillo, and El Niño Fidencio. Hendrickson's book confirmed many of the observations and conversations historians and ethnographers were having about the US-Mexico borderlands around definitions of American religions in the US, religious and cultural hybridity, and the category of religion in itself. Indeed, Hendrickson's Border Medicine introduces a transcultural theory of religious healing in his history of the American Southwest after the Mexican-American War. He highlights moments and narratives of contact between Anglo-American and Mexican-American religious healers and communities. Hendrickson traces parallel histories of religion in the United States, the metaphysical traditions of white settlers, mesmerism, New Thought, spiritualism, New Age practices, and the histories of traditions in the Mexican borderlands, curanderismo, espiritismo, and espiritualismo. Through the biographies of that borderland trinity, Urrea, Jaramillo, and Niño Fidencio, as well as Francis Schlatter, Hendrickson illustrates the transcultural healing practices between white folks and Mexican communities. The encounters described exemplify this predisposition and openness to healing created through knowledge and experience of metaphysical traditions brought west by white settlers, as well as the hybrid traditions found within curanderismo. As Hendrickson describes, Mexican curanderos and curanderas negotiated their own healing traditions in this changing cultural landscape. The last section of Border Medicine draws from Hendrickson's fieldwork in New Mexico and addresses the politics of cultural exchange and questions of appropriation in contemporary practices. Here, Hendrickson's encounters with contemporary curanderos and curanderas reveals healing practices often influenced by the New Age, right, and grappling with other questions of authenticity. He reveals the tension of defining a so-called pure and authentic curandero practice linked to pre-colonial indigenous history, as well as more modern practices attributed to metaphysical religions. The distancing of more traditionally Roman Catholic practices in curanderismo in favor of a universal spiritual tone not only makes Mexican healing more marketable to white audiences, but also reflects the influence and importance of those transcultural exchanges. So rereading Border Medicine in 2020 brought a different set of questions to my mind than the first time I read it, which was too many years ago. Today, we are dealing with a global pandemic that disproportionately affects Latinx communities, including access to healthcare, incarceration and detention of migrants, and the revival of the cultural of poverty argument in academic discourse. Brett, I wonder if you might be able to offer a reflection on your research today, given both the context of recent events, but also the larger context of American history.
All right, thank you. That was really nice. It's always great to hear a summary because you always wonder, is anyone reading this at all? And so thank you very much for doing it. I appreciate it. Yeah, that was. It's been a while since I wrote Border Medicine. It came out of my dissertation, which was all written, before 2010 for the most part, and then a lot of the field work came after that for the second part of the book. But I would say that, it's really hard to link those things to this particular stage in our history. I feel maybe I'm wrong about this. Maybe as an historian I shouldn't say this, but I feel like we've departed in so many ways from, business as usual. Not to say that there aren't any linkages. I would be interested in thinking about how we still haven't come to a place where I'm kind of grasping at straws right now. I'm sorry that in our current climate, I guess, when we're all trying to care about our health against one particular illness, it seems to me that there is less room than ever for most people to think about traditional medicine, what people might call folk medicine, or in some ways new agey or spiritual medicine, CAM, complementary alternative medicines. That those things, I think, by at least a certain part of the population, are considered to be possibly part of the world of denying things, of not wanting to take vaccines, of not wanting to participate in scientific advice that could be helping all of us right now. So I think it's a little hard to think in depth, at least from my point of view, about the sorts of things I was writing about in Border Medicine, because it seems like in a moment of crisis, a lot of people want to bracket that kind of medicine and tradition. On the other hand, it also maybe introduces some interesting bedfellows or strange bedfellows. I'm remembering the image from earlier in the summer where the blonde white lady was like hanging out the side of a car window or something and going down the street and saying like how Jesus was going to save everybody from the coronavirus. Do you remember this? That
I think so, yeah.
That on the other hand, what could possibly heal us would be, at this point, the only thing that could heal us, according to some people, would be miraculous intervention or protection. But I'm sure that's only reserved for certain forms of, faithful expression that aren't necessarily available to all of us. So I don't know if that really answers your question very well, but I do feel like it's harder at this moment to make contemporary or make relevant this kind of scholarship. On the other hand, sorry, I should stop and wait for another question instead of continuing to dig myself a hole here. As far as what you mentioned is that Latinx people are suffering at higher rates from COVID than other communities, and the same goes for African Americans. Mm-hmm. One could say that one argument that people have made is that the persistence of things like curanderismo has to do with the fact that Latinx people and other people of color have not had good access to biomedicine. And as a result, they would resort to curanderismo. Now, I don't think that's a completely compelling argument. On the other hand, I think it's clear that the higher rates of morbidity right now for Latinx people and African American people have everything to do with racist exclusion from the healthcare system. Mm-hmm. Now, whether or not that, I wouldn't know how to tie exactly the lines to how that would be supporting traditional medicine. I'm not sure it does, other than, if people really are forced into this argument that it's a medicine of last resort, then maybe that's where we are.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Following up on that, we had Wendy Marshall in, and she was kind of talking about, because one of the points in the book that I think is really interesting that you make is that, traditional healing, botanicas, all the stuff is actually increasing in kind of popularity, especially among young people. And when we were talking with, which I've seen too, because I teach courses at my university, Hamlin. I'm actually teaching one in the fall about traditional medicine from a Native American African perspective. And it's full. It filled within an hour. Yeah, within an hour. And, when I've taught this course in the past, a lot of my students come to me and they say, I just hate our medical system. It just is exhausting. And a lot of students have said, I think it's making me sick. And one of the things that Wendy Marshall said, that one of the ways that traditional medicine, or whatever category we want to use to describe it, but in this case, botanicas, traditional healers working at the border, is that unlike maybe, I don't want to draw such a contrast here, but unlike public health or doctors or traditional healthcare workers, traditional healers have more of a focus on the environment and social and economic conditions.
Yeah.
And how that might impact and inform someone's health.
Yeah.
Which I don't know if you see that, because I think you talk a lot about in the book about that, which I think is great.
Yeah, that's fascinating. And I think one of the major reasons that people maintain connections to curanderismo and other forms of ethnically traditional medicine, if you want to say something like that, is precisely that not only that they find that it works, but that they find that the entire environment of the healing is something that's a lot more conducive to getting better, and addresses them not only as an entire person, but as a person within a family or community, which people find really helpful. And I mean, I don't want to at all critique healthcare workers right now.
Right. With you 100%, yeah.
Yeah, in a way, that sort of medicine is exactly what we need. And I mean, I'm not a medical doctor, I can't give medical advice, but going much longer than sticking a Q-tip up somebody's nose, we also need contact tracers, which in a way sort of contextually consider the person and their connections, in addition to looking at, the flora and fauna that's invading the body or whatever.
Right. So. Yeah. No, and I 100% agree with that. In Africa, they have it's called medical pluralism, where you have kind of, because they just have this category called medicine, and they don't distinguish between in the way that we do. Right. And they kind of, specifically in Madagascar, other countries too, are really good at having traditional healers, healthcare workers, doctors work collaboratively together.
Yeah.
I think, yeah.
Yeah. I think, if the trouble, of course, I think, as we're all noticing right now, is that a lack of a public health system in any real way is really hurting us now. It's not only that we have a horrible leader, it's that, there's no structure to kind of combat his horror, that in a public health system that would be dealing with prevention, that would be dealing with these sorts of things. So, yeah.
I mean, it's really interesting to think about the historical period that you're writing about, right? Pedrito Jaramillo in particular, right? The creation of the American Medical Association, these categories of so-called quackery, right?
Yes.
And not the same moments, right? But I can kind of see those tensions still today, right? Is how do people understand what medicine is and what's, what works and what doesn't work? And, when do you trust medical professionals and when do you distrust them and these kinds of things? But I think I really like your story about the cowboy boots. I think maybe I'm making up the cowboy boot part, but the boots and the tomatoes, right?
And the tomatoes, yeah. Jaramillo makes, he fills up the tomato, he pours a bunch of cans of tomatoes in the boots, and this really helps this guy's feet. So, yeah. It's effective, it works. I think that's one good measure to talk about just what are results. But I think ultimately what's one of the reasons I never have been attracted to the kind of research that might be more, double-blind trials or something like that with particular herbs from a botanica or something like that, is I just don't feel like those are epistemologically the right kind of approach to this. That's not what kind of experience is being had. It's not what people are I think trying to achieve. They're trying to feel better, which might be. It may be different than a strictly scientific outcome. Not to say that there's never overlap. With Jaramillo and with these other, I love that trinity. That's a funny one. It has a lot more, I think, to do with the other theory that I put forward in the book that I really love is Thomas Shortis's theory of healing, religious healing, which is a complex theory, but to kind of boil it down, that there are these, it's kind of a Bourdieuian theory that there are these predispositions that we carry in our bodies that can really be affected by stories. Stories, and or rituals are really somatic in that regard, and also social. And I think that those sorts of things are ultimately really important. And actually, when I don't know who was it, you, Amanda, who said that, or was it Daisy? I'm forgetting now. Someone going to the doctor saying participating in the system is making me sick.
Yeah, I had a student literally say that.
Yeah, I feel one way we could read that sort of anthropologically is to say the story of our current healthcare system is a sick story. It's a story that is not about making people better. It's about other things too often for people, and that's having a serious effect. So yeah. Well, you all are really pushing me as a historian to try to figure out contemporary this. I didn't mean for it to be relevant. This isn't supposed to be relevant.
I'm gonna try to push on that same sort of trajectory, but by taking a step back. So you mentioned, I thought it was really interesting, the possibility for curanderos serving and curanderas serving as contact tracers. So there's a bunch of other things, right? So there's people who are less symptomatic or asymptomatic and don't feel well, but don't need to go into the hospital, or people that do spend some time at the hospital and then come back and have all these long-term sort of recovery issues. So I wonder what other roles curanderos and curanderas might play. But going backwards and thinking about your experiences, so what were some of the roles that some of the healers were? Maybe even takes place, or you do it through looking at the trinity of or the history, or some of the specific people and practices, and then seeing if maybe any of those are still relevant in terms of the less symptomatic or asymptomatic or long-term recovery sorts of things.
That's a really great question. I would say that the asymptomatic care is tricky, because I think that the whole idea of being sick asymptomatically doesn't fit into this that well. You know, that really is, I think, you know, something that is germ theory more than something else, you know, and not just theory that, you know, you're carrying the disease, but with that said, I think that, you know, there might be, there are ways of caring that are part of curanderismo that would work here. First of all, possibly meeting not just with a patient, but with a patient within a family unit. Thinking about, you know, how are ways that your behavior and your body and the way you're feeling are related to your whole family. Now, again, I feel like I'm really on thin ice here because this is way past my era, and for the most part. The other thing I was thinking of, though, would be potentially sort of body work that is both really popular among a lot of CAM, like Reiki or certain types of massage or rolfing or what's that? I can never remember the name of it, where it's like the little hot cups that you know what I'm talking about. Anyway, I can't think of the name of it. Yeah, cupping. Yeah, hot cupping. There we go. Easy. Those sorts of things that are some of those are shared very much with different types of curanderismo, and possibly, I don't know if those would have. I mean, I don't think that those have any effect on a virus per se. On the other hand, that kind of like therapeutic attention to people, mostly when they're feeling sick, but even when they maybe are dealing with the fact that they're dangerous to other people and don't feel sick, could be something that, you know, this kind of healthcare system could, you know, traditional healing could help with. I also wanted to point out too that, you know, most curanderas are Catholics, and I think one of the other things that's happening right now too is how limited people are from being in their physical religious communities, particularly Catholic or other Christian religious communities. And that if there were a way that a curandera in this sense could be a little bit like a parish nurse, that would be amazing. And you know, again, I'm just thinking that would be nice. I don't have any sort of, there's no evidence of that I know of. But that would be a really nice partnership and coalition to, you know, to move on this. And one can imagine in a different country where community-based healthcare policy would be related to state and federal healthcare policy in a way that would promote those sorts of things. I don't think we live in that country right now.
Mm-hmm. If I can just add to that, Michelle Gonzalez, who is a professor of religious studies, did an interview with, you know, every once in a while, actually pretty often, you'll get these newspaper journalists that want to do a story about botanicas, right? Oh, yeah. So she was tapped to do an interview, and in the interview, cool. Right, a curandera and a botanica was saying, you know, I have people coming in here, and I'm not a you know, a doctor, but I've been referring people to go to the hospital, right? So maybe not contact tracing, but definitely, and also my own experience among curanderas in Southern California is that they'll say, there are things I cannot treat, right? I can treat certain maladies, but I can't treat other things. So perhaps as a middle person, right, or a liaison to refer people.
Yeah. I was listening to an NPR story the other day about Nairobi. And I guess the price of lemons has really jumped in Nairobi, the NPR reporter was saying, because lemons are a key ingredient in a lot of these sort of folk medicines that are sold in markets in Nairobi. And he said they're just going gangbusters right now, these remedies are. Mm-hmm. But then he ended the thing by saying, on the other hand, no one thinks that these are going to cure COVID. They all understand that these aren't cures for COVID. They just find them deeply comforting right now in a time of like major upheaval. And so I think it was a really nice piece of reporting for once of not saying like these people are pre-scientific and in of course the incredibly modern city of Nairobi. It wasn't about that. It was about how tradition is part of wellness, even if it isn't necessarily giving a cure to this very, you know, serious virus. So.
I think your comments just now and also Daisy's word choice in liaison really point towards this. Perhaps it's going to come out as more of a comment than a question just because I'm thinking on my feet. But in the conclusion, you say, speaking of the kinship ties, responsibilities, and friendships that curanderos facilitate, you say, those support structures and relationships create a new and healthier dependency, a dependency that ultimately supports ongoing nurture within a reliable community. And as I'm sitting in Chapel Hill, which feels like ground zero right now, as I'm fielding innumerable emails that I have no way of, completely responding to, as I'm not a public health expert nor a mental health expert, the pretty much only comfort I can find is that I can be somewhat of a liaison to mutual aid for my students. And I mean, it's just exactly what you're speaking of, even though you started this by saying, I'm not sure if it applies. Like, it feels like it completely applies. Of course, that's my lens
good.
as a reader, right? But there's so much more that goes on around the event of being sick than just being sick. There's an anxiety of becoming sick. There's someone, like Harold was mentioning, infrastructure, like someone has to drive you to a hospital, or there's care that goes into this, like before and after the event of finding out that you are confirmed in Western medical standards as being sick, which not everybody has access to that confirmation either, right? So
Right.
I'm wondering if you could speak a little bit more to just how the communities and individuals you were working with were facilitating that intermediary relationship between community needs and availability of what could provide healing in different senses, I think.
Yeah, that's a great question. When, as Daisy pointed out, a lot of the historical research in the first part of the book, and also some of the field work and personal interactions in the second part, a lot of my thesis was that Mexican American religious healing has not been and continues to not be contained within the Mexican American ethnic community. That it is having and has had a sizable and important impact on white settlers and other Anglo and non-Latino people in the United States. And so I think, looking back at like grad school me, who was writing a lot of this and early career, I think I was probably trying to be hopeful that even with the title border medicine, this idea, like a play on words a little bit, that curanderismo and these kinds of traditions could help heal the divisions that have existed. And I think obviously that's naive and in a lot of ways and not complete. On the other hand, I think that the fact that these traditions can be effective, even though they don't have a quote unquote biomedical basis, shows that communities of mutual care, I think is what the word I use sometimes, or the phrase, are really important. And sociologists and political science have shown us too that this kind of bridging is ultimately pretty much all we've got, other than major structural change, to overcome and address serious divisions in our society. And that's what we've got. I feel like we just have to keep promoting that sort of thing. And I think that what gets tricky is there also, of course, it can be the very problematic dynamics of appropriation, or even theft of somebody's cultural traditions. And that's not, I think that there can be a lot of different ways to think about that without, I don't think we can say that these sorts of things are always appropriation or theft, or always are like just free and easy exchanges on the the marketplace of ideas. Ultimately they come down to actual people dealing with each other, sometimes in healthy and productive ways, and sometimes not. Mm-hmm. I think that one of the things I was real nervous about and continue to be nervous about with border medicine is I kind of imply that modern day curanderos have found their most important niche in some ways in US society in kind of the New Age spiritual world. And it's not even a world that I inhabit. I'm not much of a dabbler. It's not something I do a lot. On the other hand, I think that it has created a place, or the market has created a place, or a place exists where people talk to each other and feel really excited with each other. Like tons of curanderas who are, 18 million generation Mexicans or whatever, love Reiki and yoga, and that's important too, that it goes in both ways. And ultimately in a time like this, and sorry, I'm totally rambling now, in a time like this when we really need to feel better, I really hate to like condemn anyone trying to get it together. And
so I was thinking about this, like in terms of the exchange of ideas as one way to describe the relationship, and then there's other ways as well. But one of the CSRC's research fellows, Abel Gomez, is working on trying to like connect the ways in which epidemic diseases during the colonial era influenced certain patterns and structures that are now influencing or impacting indigenous communities today in terms of the COVID-19 pandemic, right? So one of the things that you talk about early on in the history is this potential exchange of ideas between, was it Jesuits coming in and having this idea that death is not a failure of the particular health practices, right? That it's possibly, and it went both ways, right? Whether it was someone from an indigenous community or whether it was one of their own, that it was it was not a sign of a failure. So I wonder, like, so some of these historical structures in terms of the exchanges that were in place, because you try to like chart this this line between those early exchanges and then some of the things that are happening in terms of like more contemporary marketplaces that are fostering a different set of exchanges.
And those Jesuits are rough too, because some of them were cold-hearted. They did these massive baptisms in New Spain, thousands of people in a day sometimes, and then people would often die shortly thereafter, and that was then cause for celebration. So it wasn't like they were saying death is a natural part of life, that we all, it's the great circle of life or whatever. They were really thinking like these were sort of like wins for our side, and we don't have to go through the trouble of having like these people to bother us. They died in grace, basically. And so they died in a good way as far as the Jesuits were concerned, in sort of a very, I think, abstract theological way. On the other hand, to play that way, I guess, as there were other Jesuits who were very committed to learning medical knowledge, such that they could continue to help people as part of their overall calling as missionaries and as fathers in the church and brothers. As far as bringing that up to the contemporary situation, I don't think it's quite as clear. I mean, maybe it should be as clear. I feel like the attitude of the Jesuits were saying, well, they died in grace, and maybe I'm getting outside my expertise here, but to me that feels reminiscent of people saying today, well, we should just open up everything and get some massive herd immunity, and some people are going to die. That's just the price we have to pay as a society. Okay, so that's like to my mind, not a healthy way of thinking about death as part of like a natural way of all of us getting better.
So I was wondering about, in terms of the relationship in the exchanges, the potential modalities of exchanges. So there was a hierarchical relationship in that the historical example that we were looking at, and then you have a market that emerges, and it's not devoid of a hierarchical relationship either, right? So and then thinking about then how right. So as Wendy Marshall was talking about in our initial podcast, who are the experts in the contemporary moment, and like you and so many of us want to say, well, we're not health experts, right? We should listen to the scientists and the doctors and so forth. But again, this is also fraught with issues of hierarchies in terms of exchanges around knowledge production.
Yeah, that's a good question. And, you know, one of the things that comes up in border medicine is, how do you become a curandera? And, you know, how did that happen historically? How does it happen now? And I think it's related to this marketplace issue that, you know, maybe historically, at least according to lore, which is hard to, you know, sort of verify outside of just the context of lore, you know, that you were considered to have a gift, and there'd be some, you know, amazing curandera old lady in your, you know, your town, and she would take you under her wing, and, you know, train you up nice. You know, kind of like, I don't know if you all have read Bless Me Ultima. It's a wonderful book, but, you know, that kind of idea. And then you get the sense now that there might still be the recognition of a gift, of someone being called to, or having a special aptitude for healing. But all the curanderos who work in botanicas in California, I mean, I don't know, Daisy probably knows better than I do, what the apprentice situation is, or how do you get into this. You know, there's probably some apprenticing, but there might also be some people who just are hustlers, you know, to get out there and do the job, you know. And then there are also, I mean, if we don't have time right now, but if you Google it, you can become a curandera right now, or a curandero. Just take the course on the internet, you know, possibly for free, possibly for money. So one of the arguments I make in the book is that one of the reasons why curanderismo has been less tied up in questions of appropriation that you hear a lot with Native American studies, is that accessing the curandero has always, to a certain extent, been a commercial interaction. You know, there's sometimes an idea that it should be free, or just because you love this person, but it's not free. You're still supporting them as a community in those kinds of scenarios. And now in like a modern economy, that's with money or something, you know, a trade. Mm-hmm. That doesn't get to your question though very well, Harold, in the sense that doesn't really critique what's available and what's not available, and to whom and by whom. With that said, though, I think that there are, it's certainly not a black market, but I feel like there are markets that are accessible to some people that aren't necessarily accessible to others, and in a way that maybe exclude, you know, like I think I would have a hard time, being who I am, like going to, let's say, Albuquerque and setting up a botanica and claiming that I'm a curandero, you know, just because of my identity as a white guy. I don't know what I'm doing, these sorts of things. And maybe it would be more possible for someone with a Mexican American heritage. I don't know for a fact. Mm-hmm. I suspect it would be. Yeah, I really think this is a place for more research. There's a really interesting book. I can't think of the name of it right now, but it traces, you know, those little milagros, the little like tin, you know, they're often body parts. Yeah. It's an analysis. It came out with University of Arizona Press. I can't think of the name of it right now, but it looks and sees how those things are produced in factories in China, and how then they are, you know, the kind of chain, the what is it called in business? I'm horrible at this. The chain of supply chains of these like little knickknacks and things that you would buy in a botanica. They're being produced, you know, overseas and sort of, you know, in Asian factories. So, you know, that's an interesting question too, how these have become parts of like part of the global capitalist economy.
Yeah. So Patrick Polk, who I'm think was going to be on this podcast,
Yeah.
but I'm not sure where he is. He's actually been doing that in LA, is looking at that supply chain. I mean, he's got this great, if you are friends with him on Facebook, he's got this great image of Saint Expedite stepping on a bald eagle, right? And so he's, you know, it's a funny way to, you know, really interesting to think about the translation of certain religious and cultural practices in the US, and especially in the US-Mexico borderlands and Roman Catholicism, right? And then kind of moving to China and then moving back, right? And what happens in that translation. So yeah, I mean, it's kind of fascinating to think
I don't know
about
enough about it, but I think that would be fascinating to look at that and see, you know, how those sort of goods, actual physical goods, get manufactured and sold.
Yeah, so I guess another thing to think about would be not only the potential role that curanderismo could play in addressing health issues currently in the COVID-19 pandemic time, but also how those practices themselves are being impacted. So whether the supply chain is being impacted, whether people have less access to healers, and what kinds of broader issues that's bringing up. So people don't have access to these healers. What are the other health issues that are going to be exacerbated by lack of access?
Yeah, it's a great question. Yeah.
And what will be authorized, you know, by scholarship reporting on this as authentic healing practices, because often these candles or other items are spoken about as kitsch in certain veins of scholarship rather than legitimate sacred objects. And as someone studying the medieval period, it's very interesting to me that body parts like are often authorized as sacred objects in the medieval period, but they're kind of similar things that people are taking from pilgrimages in a very similar way. So I'd be interested to hear you speak a little bit about how some of these objects are and are not recognized in scholarly vocabularies as religious, but also the ways that some of these curanderos and curanderas were saying that this was not religious to them.
Yeah, that's you know, this is kind of the perennial question for religious studies in a way. You know, what are we doing here, and what do we study? You know, I'm thinking about you know, I think some of the only way that some people have been able to deal with their own tradition, as you know, interacting with curanderismo and thinking about it as having sort of a heritage or a long history going back from before the Spanish or whatever, is to even say, this is my religion. You know, I don't think many people say that, but I've talked to a few people that say, you know, this is what I believe in. This is my system of belief. I think one place where that gets maybe most clearly expressed are in a few of the groups that claim that they're the Church of Niño Fidencio, like different Fidencista groups that have formed an entire elaborate sort of hierarchy and rituals and, you know, paraments and all kinds of stuff. I think in a way, watching new religions develop that are rooted somewhat in curanderismo or Mexican folk healing is a little bit showing that the power of what we're doing is real. You know, it's not just us sitting in our universities and teaching and writing books and stuff. That, you know, our ability to define things as religion or not religion are making an impact in a way that are affecting how people want to define themselves and what they're doing. Of saying, okay, yeah, you know, if we're going to be religious, then we need to like make this a real thing. We can't just do what we're doing and carry on. I think the chapter that addresses this most in border medicine is the one about Fidencio, where in shamanism in general and the creation of neo-shamanism, which is basically a creation of anthropologists that, you know, study various people and decide to come back and kind of promote it as a universal system of accessible to everyone, particularly like Michael Harner, the guy Carlos Castañeda, who wrote the Don Juan books, these sorts of things where those things enter the culture in a way that I think is really tangible and carries on. And there was a great phrase that I came across in my research of calling these guys like Michael Harner shamanthropologists, kind of a neologism, and I think that's really apt. I don't really think I have the theoretical skills or wherewithal, or sort of even like the personality maybe, to think about how I'm doing that too in my own classes in a way that I'm maybe not as aware of, or maybe I should be more aware of communicating what's real and what's not real in what I write and what I teach. But it's kind of a cautionary tale, I guess. On the other hand, I don't think we should always think of those things as ultimately negative. I mean, I think that they are just things, again, that are open to study, that we can see that these are processes of the way things develop. And, I don't think that, just because we interfere necessarily as scholars that it's become sort of not real or true anymore. I mean, we're part of what's real and true too.
Does anybody else want to ask a question? I was just going to say, yeah. Go ahead, sure.
Brett,
or Kayla too. Yeah.
Oh, for sure. Yeah. Brett, can you, for the listeners who will be listening into our conversation and haven't read the book, maybe like share a story that you heard about in your fieldwork that kind of epitomizes why it is that the stories we tell, are key to learning how to heal, because the stories will define what that illness is that we're suffering from. And then kind of explain, what is it about the Southwest region in particular, its peculiar landscape or geography, perhaps, the expansiveness. I think the word expansive comes in your book a couple of times, if not more. But there's something about that region that we kind of need to meditate on, I suppose, right? Because I mean, one of the things I really love about the book is I'm trained in American religious history, and the category of region is really important. Northeast, Pacific Northwest, the Prairie Midwest, Southeast, and even the places like Arkansas and the Ozark region. I mean, Bethany Moten's book on Walmart is all about why the Ozark region is so important. So I'm just like, I'm interested in you here telling us a little more about what is it about the Southwest that's so important here.
Okay, great. Well, as far as a key story goes from the text, that's a great question. There's a story, when I was writing the dissertation, I was living outside St. Louis, Missouri, because my wife had gotten a job there, and I'd finished coursework at Arizona State, and we were living outside St. Louis. And I went to the public library in St. Louis, and I found the newspaper of when Teresa Urrea, one of the three, was on her national tour, when she had come to St. Louis and had just gathered this humongous crowd there in the city. And of course, these are all, like, I wouldn't want to say all, but mostly white people. A lot of them of like German descent in the St. Louis area at the time. And many of them were giving these kind of testimonies of like, this is amazing. She's a miracle worker. Like, she knew exactly what was wrong with me, or she's got incredible ability to see what I am, what's wrong and how to fix it. And these kind of stories you can kind of trace in the newspaper accounts across the country. Brandon Bain had an article about this in Church History a long time ago about this. And I think those kind of things are really fascinating, because I think it's really hard to imagine in 2020 what it must have been like for a middle class, let's say Mexican woman, to go on a healing tour of the United States in the very first decade of the 20th century, and what that would be like for people. Mm-hmm. And I try to tell that story. What were the sort of probable assumptions that people were making and having, and they're different from how I feel, how we are now. The past is a foreign country in this regard. Like, it's a different time, and people were not thinking of her as I think they would think about her today, and they were very receptive to her talents and skills and presence. and why is that is kind of the interesting question. And so, who today continues to be receptive to those sorts of healers is another group of people, but it's still for reasons that we can study and think about. As far as the Southwest goes, it's probably just my own little romantic fantasy in some ways. I love the Southwest. I lived in New Mexico for a couple years, and I lived in Arizona for a few years. I lived in Texas for a few years. I've never lived in California, and I'm not sure it's the Southwest, maybe. Exactly. I'm not sure. I'm not the one who would decide. Yeah. First of all, I think I was just preparing a lecture before I got on the podcast for my Latino religions class about Aztlan and the land of Aztlan. And I think it makes a really important difference that this was the heartland of northern Mexico and northern New Spain for centuries. Not Mexico, but from New Spain and then Mexico. This is a part of our country that was unlike, it was stolen from the indigenous people before we got there, to steal it from them. It's a part of it was a part of an imperial acquisition rather than part of just regular westward marching settler colonialism. And I think that's really important to the identity of the area. And I also think the fact that there are today 37 million Mexican Americans, many of whom live in the Southwest states, is extremely important. I mean, that's about the size of the population of Canada, the Mexican Americans. It's more than 10% of the population. It's an incredibly important component of who we are. And I know not all Mexican Americans live in the Southwest, but as a geographical sort of center of gravity, that's where it is. The other thing I think that's interesting about it is that at least, and this is not completely true in the last few decades, but the whole heritage of the Old West is a stereotype and a cliche from the movies, and has some things that are true about it. With the big ranches and the people who are trying to recreate themselves in nowhere. It's a place where white settlers have very much gone in order to imagine themselves in a completely new place. And I think that has colored the culture of the area, for sure. From Texas to Arizona to New Mexico as well. Maybe a little less in New Mexico, but certainly in New Mexico as well, with all the Taos artists and everything like that. It's just been kind of a fantasy land. And yeah, so it's just got so much going on about it. But if I could plug a couple things, I'm really excited to hear about all these centers working on religion in the city. There's a few people now working, myself included, on projects that are about religion in the American West. Tisa Wenger at Yale has a project going on with the New York Public Library right now. And you could look into that. They're looking for researchers. And then I and Brandy Dennison, who's at the University of North Florida, in a couple of years are going to be collaborating with the Clement Center for a study of the Southwest at SMU. We're going to have a series of symposia about religion in the American West that will hopefully lead to an edited volume. It's been pushed back, I think, until 2023 because of COVID, and we're kind of in the queue, but we're getting there too. So thinking about the importance of region and religion in the area is definitely, it's on my radar and other people's radar too.
Yeah, definitely send those resources an email so that we could maybe put them up with the podcast and put them on the website along with the podcast. That would be great. Does anybody else have a question that they didn't get in yet? Yeah, is Daisy? Yeah, go ahead. And anyway.
Right. So I feel like I've been following your trajectory as a scholar, right, with border medicine, and I was in grad school, and I was actually living in Albuquerque when your book on Chimayo came out. I was, making kind of weekly trips up to that shrine, also about healing, right? So, can you, I guess more of a personal question is, what is it about, you've talked a bit about what what's special about the Southwest. But it's also about healing, right? It's landscape and healing, and this is something that's kind of, you know, the thing that connects your scholarship. Can you reflect on that?
That's a good question. Let me give a nice personal answer too. You know, I got to grad school at ASU, and I knew I wanted to study, Catholic practice at the border. And so you immediately start to hear about these folk saints and everything like that. And so, I'm going to study folk saints. That seems great. But then what got me eventually studying curanderismo is that it just seemed every single thing that people wanted from the folk saints was healing. They wanted wellness. I even thought briefly that it would be interesting to, and again, I've already told you I don't think I have the theoretical chops for this, but to come up with a theory of religion that instead of being like flows and currents or whatever, that it's healing, that religion is healing. That's what it's about, I think that would be really fascinating. I mean, I'm sure it's other stuff too, but that would be a really cool theoretical project to work on for someone who could do it. The other part, as I end up mentioning in border medicine, is, before I became an academic, I was a Presbyterian minister. And, it's that theory of healing would be, it certainly would work in my very different context of older Anglo-Presbyterians who, all they want, even though they don't really, I think half the time think that God can hear them, that, prayer is all about healing almost every time. That's what, at least in the modern world, and I would say if you study the medieval world, not too bad either. Healing is what people want from their religion so much. And that's really exciting to me. And I think it's one of the reasons why, too, medical humanities programs are flourishing so much around the country right now. Because people go to college that cost like $1 million and they think they want to be a doctor because they want to make tons of money. But then they realize they love their humanities classes. And they're like, well, I'll go into medical humanities, because what they care about are these stories. What we really care about, or not we, we, those of us gathered here, but I think all of us actually, we really, really care about this.
Yeah, I think, so if anybody else has another question, or did we get everybody? I just want to make sure that everybody got it. So yeah, I think that's a great way to kind of end too, is kind of what you think, Brett, too, on, what's our job as religion scholars here? Our role, are we the ones, are we falling behind here? Like, how can we, because we're talking about medical humanities, what are things that we can do to create a more kind of integrated, pluralistic model of healthcare for America? What can we do? Are
you asking me?
Yeah, I'm asking you. Yeah, there you go. Can you solve all the world's issues right now in like 2 minutes?
I also teach a class in religion and healing, and it has never been like, well, this is what Muslims think, and this is what Jews think, and this is what Buddhists think. It's never really been that. To the great chagrin, I think, of some of my students who, just want to like get in there and figure out what everybody understands and move on. And there are quite a few textbooks. A lot of them are used in nursing programs, actually, that do just that. They're like, and if you have a Buddhist patient, this is what they're going to be like. And if you have a Hindu, this is what they're going to be like.
Can I interrupt really quick? I'm sorry, because
Sure.
Sierra actually has experience with that exact problematic approach to it. I wonder if you could say a little bit about that, Sierra.
Yeah, I'd love to hear it.
I'll plug my article I published. I co-authored
cool.
a few years ago with Stephen Ramey, who's at the University of Alabama. It's titled Sourcing Stereotypes, and basically exactly what you were describing. I was very frustrated with simplistic representations of communities in medical literature. And so specifically one textbook, I printed out their chart and I looked at all their sources, and like the walls of my room when I was a master's student were just source on source on source on source of like who they were citing and what they were doing. And I found that actually they had completely misconstrued data, which we could talk about what it means to even collect data in the first place, but they had basically taken findings where Black women were being under-provided with medical care and therefore were requesting equal access to care, but they were framing that as Black patients being more demanding. That is what the chart was framing it as. They also took studies on individuals who were displaced by world wars, who were not English speaking, and who were Jewish. And they didn't factor that English speaking part into the conclusion. And they used that data to say that Jews were more vocal, without saying that the researchers were English speakers, and therefore someone who, as you can tell, it gets very complicated. But as I followed down this rabbit hole of trying to figure out where these conclusions came from for this chart that was made for nursing students, and as far as I can tell is still on the market. And yeah, so thanks, Harold, for that. But yeah, so
yeah. And what do you, I know you asked me, but I think you're probably more able to say the question here. Like, what's a better approach?
So I compared it to the world religions paradigm. Professor Ramey and I compared it to that, and just that was our last section. We said, so what do we do? Do we never make a chart? And I remember when I presented this article, a professor of New Testament said like something along the lines of, well, I would never use a chart in my class. And I said, well, I took your class when I was an undergrad, and there's this thing called the Septuagint, and then there's this canon of Hebrew Bible, and there's all these different layers, and you can use charts to portray nuance. But you also have to recognize that the form of a chart is in and of itself self-authorizing of each category that it's attempting to portray, and it's purposefully reducing, it's call it maybe strategic essentialism. And so you have to be honest about your methods while also attempting to keep them as much as nuanced as the form you're choosing allows for. So yeah, it was a very process writing that article, but it's out in the world.
Congratulations. I think that, that the answer in some ways is the one that we all know from teaching religious studies, is that the content we teach really takes a backseat to the method and critical approach that we teach. And, and that doesn't always work in the university where, content can be really like what people want, especially if they're in STEM fields where that's kind of like the name of the game sometimes. Not to throw shade on the STEM fields, but I think ultimately what's more important to teach health professionals, but anybody, is the approach that we have of listening, contrasting, thinking, taking seriously what people tell us. And also being attentive to what people do in addition to what they say, and all these sorts of things. So
yeah, and if we follow Ansel Dua and think about the border as like an herida abierta, an open wound, then I know you're hesitant to go into the like metaphor language of healing that you used in this book, but I think that the self-reflexivity that you've been describing, and the ways to think about the intersections of Catholicism with this category of what looks like folk in the United States, I think that at least allows us to like get a better perspective on what that open wound looks like and recognize it. And maybe we can't ultimately heal everything, but and the book on Chimayo also, I think, allows us to get a better sense of what was happening in the space we call the borderlands, and what is that for us today.
Thank you. I appreciate it. I mean, I think, I know you're probably trying to wrap me up here, but my approach to Mexican American religious history, especially as someone who's not a Mexican American, has consistently been to say that, this is not like an exotic tradition with walls around it. It's part of American religious history, hook, line, and sinker, and that's what I want to understand.
Awesome. Yeah, I guess, if you guys are ready, should we wrap it up, or is anybody else? Yeah, we're like right at that time. We could ask one more or wrap it up. I think we had really good conversation today, really lively. Thank you so much, Brett, for joining us. Thank you, Daisy, for that awesome summary. And thank you, everyone who came. for the excellent questions and the discussion, as always. So
thank you very much.
Yes. So we will be meeting again for, I think, we'll come up with a date for the next one. We're going to be doing Kevin O'Neill, The Hunted. So as our next book. Yeah. Thank you so much. So yeah, I'll keep in touch, let you guys know the date, because I know with classes starting for everyone right now and your schedules are all up, and so I think we'll come up with something. Yeah. And Brett, if you'd like to join us again too, please feel free or whatever. I know everyone's so busy right now, so I don't feel like you have to, but it was so great having you. Thank you so much. And thank you, everyone.
Well, thanks a lot, everyone. It's great to meet you and see you. Take care.
Likewise. Take care, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
See ya.
For more information about how you can get involved and make change in your community today, please visit the Contagion Religion and Cities webpage at religionandcities.org/contagion-podcast.